Stress is a major factor in depression. In this second workshop, Dr. Lockley looks at its effects, its causes, and how to cope with it.
Welcome to the second part of our workshop on Christians and depression. We're going to be talking about stress this time. Everybody talks about it. Not sure that too many people understand exactly how it all fits together. I think of stress as being stimulation that's too much for us. Because some people love stress. Some people are adrenaline junkies. They like doing things like flinging themselves out of aeroplanes with small pieces of nylon attached to them, and, you know, I don't like things like that, and that would stress me. And I like doing things like going inside caves. Very claustrophobic spaces, but a lot of people wouldn't like that. So stress isn't an absolute thing. It's a question of what we ourselves want to have happen to us. And in fact, the person who enjoys throwing themselves out of aeroplanes may not actually enjoy it if he is thrown out of an aeroplane with a aforesaid parachute attached, simply because he's not quite as in control of things as he is when he's diving out of the aeroplane of his own free will. So stress is stimulation that is too much for us. Two definitions that are quite useful. Stress is some unpleasant outside event which makes us feel uncomfortable. That's the sort of it's out there, it's stressing me approach. I think a better way of looking at it is to talk about the unpleasant experience inside ourselves when we are under pressure, because it brings the business of stress back to ourselves. The guy who's throwing himself out of the aeroplane has a choice to throw himself out of the aeroplane with parachute attached. He doesn't have to do it, so he's not finding it that stressful. The difficulty of stress, of course, is when things happen to us that we perceive to be beyond our control, and we don't know how to handle them. But it is a perception, and it's a very important one. Why am I talking about stress anyway? This is not part of depression, is it? Well, it is part of depression. Do you remember right at the beginning when we were talking about the nerve cells and how the chemicals are released from one nerve cell to another? And I said that if too much is going on, you may have all sorts of crises and problems and stresses, and they use up those chemicals, so they're not available for other things. So stress can actually bring on a depression. Stress and depression are not the same thing, but they are interlinked. Stress is also something that Christians are quite prone to, often because they misinterpret the commands of Jesus, and they think that they've got to go and save the world on their own, instead of saving the world in God's time as his hands and fingers. So God's timing on this is important. That doesn't mean Christians won't get stressed, because sometimes God asks us to get into situations that are very stressful. But he knows how much stress we can stand, and it is important that we withstand those stresses that he has chosen to put upon us because he feels we can cope with them, and also to get rid of those stresses that we shouldn't be experiencing because we are reacting improperly either to things that are happening outside or to the things that we are doing to ourselves because we've chosen to do the wrong things in the wrong way. Let's look at the effects of stress. Firstly, the effects on mood, on how we feel about things. Stress can make us anxious and worried. It can give us a sense of apprehension. It can make us keyed up. It can make us confused and forgetful. There's just so much happening, I can't cope. It can give us poor concentration. It can give us irritability or depression. It can make us bored or apathetic, simply because there is too much happening. And one of the ways that we can get out of stress is just by going into hibernation mode, and sort of cowering down, you know, letting the world pass by. The effects of stress are also on bodily organs as well. You can feel your heart pounding. You can end up with high blood pressure, rapid breathing, perspiration and flushing, lightheaded, feeling faint. You can have an upset stomach. You can have a dry mouth and throat. You can have cold hands and feet. You can need to go to the loo frequently. You can get diarrhea or constipation. Please note, all those symptoms can have other causes. And therefore, if you are suffering from those symptoms or any of those symptoms to any degree, it is important that you go and see your doctor to make sure that there is nothing else going on. The effects on the muscles of stress are that you feel stiff and tense, you can have a shaking hand, nervous twitches, inability to keep still, stuttering or stammering, clenched jaw, grinding teeth. You can end up with very sore muscles in the mouth at night from doing it in your sleep as well. You can get headaches, eye tension, a sense of eye tension, low back pain. You can be short-tempered, you can be underachieving, you can have your appetite decreased or increased, a reduced sex drive, you can sleep more or less, you can have more minor accidents, you can make more mistakes, and sometimes with people who are under a lot of stress, they can end up with an increase in drugs or smoking or alcohol, just as a way to try and relieve it. This is the cowering, sensation there, trying to make the world go away. Let's obliterate things. Here's a very big problem for people. This is the place at which half the audience is likely to walk out. Stress is something we largely do to ourselves because we allow it to happen to us. That, I think, is the important message that we need to get from this session. Okay, I hear you say, my wife is dying of cancer. How on earth can the stress of that be my fault? It isn't. But the reaction to your wife dying is actually the stress, not the fact that your wife is dying. And it's the way that you respond that will determine whether you get very, very stressed by it in a way that isn't helpful to you nor to your wife, or whether you respond in a way that is as helpful as can be under very, very difficult circumstances. It's our reaction to external events that causes stress. We have to learn in stress to take control. Remember what I said about the person being thrown out of the aeroplane? He may not enjoy it when he's pushed out the aeroplane by a sergeant major, a jump master, but he may actually enjoy it far more if he's made the choice to go up there himself. We can take control of the events themselves, not putting yourself in a position where you have to jump out of aeroplanes, or not going into deep, dark caves, or whatever it happens to be. Or, and this is where we come back to the business of my wife is dying of cancer, what do I do about it? We can change our reaction to the events. And that is a very, very important message. I'm sure you've all heard about Adrian Plass. He ended up having depression. Let's find out a bit more about it.
For the well-known writer and speaker Adrian Plass, work-related stress and unresolved tensions within the church triggered a breakdown and subsequent depression in 1984.
I first started to be aware that something was wrong, I suppose, when I hit a level of tension at work that never quite eased. And one of the problems with residential work with kids, which is what I was doing, is that there's quite a high level of tension anyway. You're waiting for one shift to finish and the next one to start. There's always a level of tension, but I found I wasn't losing any of it. This sounds very silly, but I'd started throwing litter away. I've always been very careful about litter. I found myself throwing sweet papers on the ground, and for me that was most extraordinary. So those were the little things, and things built up bit by bit till I reached a level of tension and anxiety that was pretty well unbearable. The symptoms were pretty classic, really. Things like wanting to sleep whenever there wasn't anything that I actually had to do, which I think was a way of escaping from the tensions that I was feeling. An inability to deal with people on almost any level, and I guess most centrally a sense of central wildness and randomness in my thinking and feeling. All the anchors, the yardsticks, whatever you want to call them, had kind of evaporated or drifted away, and I was rootless, floating, didn't know where I was, drinking a lot. Right at the center of this experience of mine was this scream to God saying, I want you to do something. I want some action in my life that is unequivocally from you. I don't want to read another book and say, now I understand because I read chapter 4. I want to experience you. Fellow Christians reacted in a number of different ways. Some were troubled, as they still are when people are emotionally ill. Some people were wary and nervous. Some got angry because, for goodness sake, it's the Christian religion and God is in charge and you pray and it's all right. And if you don't pray and it's not all right, then where's their faith gone? You know, what are you saying to them? In fact, of course, all you're saying is the same as I've got a broken leg or I've cut my finger. When you're emotionally stressed or you have a breakdown, in one sense, it's just the same. You're saying, I'm ill. That's all you're saying. A number of things helped me to move out of depression. One was simply having nothing to do. That was extraordinary, quite extraordinary. There are very few times in life, especially if you're made the way I am, when nothing is expected of you and you don't feel guilty. So those two conditions very rarely come together. Oddly enough, I recall the day after the doctor signed me off work, very early on, I was in a pub in Eastbourne, sitting in the garden, and for about an hour I was in, well, the nearest thing to heaven I could think of. I had nothing to do and no one to tell me off. Very childish, but that's how it was. I began to write, which became a form of therapy, really. I wrote in an upstairs room, and in the springtime of the following year, our Japanese flowering cherry came out, this amazing explosion of pink just outside the window. And that tree at that time was, for me, was a sort of symbol of life crashing out. And all these creative thoughts and feelings, I don't wish to be unduly disgusting, but as though some tubes had been unblocked. It's very difficult to say how one would help people who are going through this sort of experience. What I would say, from my own experience only, is that it sounds trite, but you need a friend. You need a friend. You don't need a Christian friend. You don't need the Bible. You don't need any kind of contrivance. What you need is a friend. And for Christians, that should be easy, shouldn't it? But they find it very difficult because they've got this evangelical imp sitting on their shoulders who's constantly saying, have you done this? Have you read a verse to him? Have you prayed for him? All these things. Forget it. Jesus needs to come to people who are in trouble like this in the form of a friend, with no agenda whatsoever. When the prodigal came back, the father threw his arms around him and said, I love you. No conditions, no conditions. Just be a friend.
Wasn't that nice? Be a friend. That's how you help people. I'm sure he doesn't mean you can't help if you're a Christian. But he does, I'm sure, have two things to say there. Firstly, that it doesn't have to be a Christian to help. And secondly, that if you are helping as a Christian, you have to be so careful that you're not adding to the problems of the stress by giving more and more oughts. You ought to be praying. You ought to be going to church. You ought to be helping with the young people. You ought, you ought, you ought. Isn't it amazing how in the church we can turn what is a forgiveness freely offered and freely given into a set of you ought to do this, you ought to do that, you ought to do the other, and if you don't, then we have to question whether you'll be on the right side of the pearly gates at the end. Isn't it a travesty of the Christian religion if that attitude takes over? And it is so easy, unfortunately, for it to come across like that. I know people don't mean it. They don't actually mean it. They actually mean be dedicated to God, give your life back to God. But it doesn't always come across like that, and particularly to somebody who is tense, worried, stressed, depressed, it will be perceived the wrong way. Remember what I was saying earlier about cognitive therapy and how you meet a friend in the street and something happens and you get the wrong idea entirely from what they've said. Well, Christians can do the same thing about Christianity. They feel they're being taught something, whereas in fact it's nothing to do with it. Then that's not their lesson. But they're being guided into a particular, or guided is the wrong word, they're being pushed into the wrong approach by well-meaning Christians who are saying what appear to be Christian things, but turn out, unfortunately, not to be quite as accurate, or not as accurate for them at that time. As somebody has said, the need is not the call. Just because there is a need, it doesn't mean that it's your call. That was a lesson it took me a very, very long time to learn. It's a very important one. There may be loads of people dying in Somalia. There may be a great need for Christian missionaries in Pakistan, but it may not be you that is being called to go there. You may be being called to do something quite different, like go into somewhere really difficult, like the city, with all its money and all the difficulties that that brings. But it may not be your call either. The need is not necessarily your call. What stresses us? Two people called Holmes and Rahe did a stress inventory in which they worked out what things caused people to be most stressed. And the basic idea is that you add up the numbers of the things that apply to you and you see how high the total gets. And if it starts to get into about 300, I think you have to start worrying about things. Obviously, things like the death of a spouse rate the highest at 100. Divorce, obviously, is stressful, 73. Marital separation, 65. Jail term, 63. Marriage. It's interesting in the Old Testament, isn't it, that people who had just got married were excused active service for a year, so they had time to get the marriage settled in. So, in our churches, do we say to our young people, you've got married, have a rest? I think we probably tend to say, you've got married, you'd be great for the youth leaders. Marital reconciliation is 45. Retirement is 45. Why is retirement so stressful? Complete change of lifestyle. For men in particular, who tend to measure themselves by their jobs, it's a removal of what it is to be themselves in many cases. Have you ever worked out what you say to somebody when you first meet them? Bet you anything. If it's a man, you say, hello, what do you do? If it's a woman, a married woman, you tend to say, hello, how many children have you got? How about that for stereotyping? It's what we do, unconsciously. And if you remove the job from the person, whether it be male or female, you tend to have problems. That's true also of the woman whose job has been the homemaker, when all the birds are flying the nest, and suddenly it's stressful. Now, there are all sorts of other things that cause us stress. Pregnancy, sex problems, new baby, new baby. Business readjustment, change in finances, large mortgage or loan. New responsibilities at work, children leaving home. Great personal achievement, scores 28. Stress, great personal achievement? Yes, it does. You have a success, and you pay for it to some extent by what happens afterwards. Those of you who went to college, do you remember what it was like after you'd done your final exam? You were promising yourself all the things you were going to do. You were going to have those parties. Maybe you were going to learn punting if you went to Oxford or Cambridge. You're going to do all this after the final exam. You do the final exam, and you don't want to do anything. How many brides do you know who were ill on their wedding day? How many brides do you know who were ill on honeymoon? Well, I know a lot. Because after the great celebration and the stress and the success, we had the wedding, it went off brilliantly, we've got the videos to prove it, isn't it wonderful? Bang, and they go down. You get the same sort of thing with teachers. Teachers get ill in the holidays. They can manage to put it off, and they get ill in the holidays. Achievements, stress afterwards. Again, we've got all sorts of obvious things. Trouble with the boss, changing working conditions, change in home. A holiday causes stress? Yes, it does. Yeah. Christmas causes stress. Christmas causes more stress than a minor law violation. These stresses mount up, and as I said, you add them together and you see what your total is, and you then start thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, I'm running into difficulty here. And because you have the ability now to look at how your stresses are working out, you also have the ability to start thinking, what do I do about them? Hence the business of, if you have people in your churches who are just about to get married, don't get them to do other things. At least not unreasonable things. There is a vicious circle in stress. Start at the top. Hard work gives overtiredness. Overtiredness goes to inefficiency. Inefficiency goes to discouragement. That goes to self-pity. Then you start giving up, and then you feel guilty. So you try harder. Round and round and round and round and round and round it goes, until the coronary or the divorce stops it dead, if you aren't listening to your own symptoms and your own situation. Or somebody sacks you because you've done something diabolical. Maybe somebody's got killed at work because of a mistake you made. And I'm not thinking of doctors either. I'm thinking of people in the construction industry where it's so easy to make a mistake and somebody falls off the scaffolding. Or you lose a lot of money for your firm because you forgot to do something about an important contract. These things have a way of self-terminating if you don't terminate them for yourself. So what you have to do with stress is to sort it out because it's your problem, not anybody else's, because nobody else can sort out your problem for you. Sorry if that gives you stress, by the way. I want to show you a set of graphs now, which I find very helpful, and I only learned about this about 10 years ago. It is a super way of looking at the things that stress and why people behave in the way they do. It's an idea that you can draw for yourself and may, with a bit of luck, get a couple of you here thinking, hey, I can see myself in this. What you do is you draw a graph of your satisfaction and dissatisfaction in various areas. So here's somebody who's happily married, but they don't like their work. The church is a pretty nice place to be. The children are nice to be with, and the money's all right. There's a person who, on balance, is happy. Add it all up, you can work out that that block is not as big as the sum total of those blocks together. So you have basically a happy person. Not so happy. Here's somebody whose marriage isn't doing too well, and their work isn't doing too well. Church is a little bit supportive. Oh dear, children. And the money's okay. All right. Well, you can get along for a bit like that. What sometimes helps people like that is to have a holiday. Stress of whatever it was on our graph, remember. Not all benefits come from holidays. But a holiday can often be very, very useful under circumstances like this, where temporarily you can forget things. And maybe the marriage which has had problems because the work's been absorbing all your time, now you're able to go and talk with your spouse a bit more and do a few more things together. Maybe that'll work a little bit better. So, you know, and maybe the children will be happy because they see more of you and whatever. So a quick fix of a holiday will sort out some of these things. That's not bad. What happens if the holiday doesn't work? It's only a quick fix after all. What happens if your marriage problems are a bit more long-standing and the work problems really don't look as though they're going to go away? That explains quite neatly why certain people go off and go shopping a lot. In fact, it explains why people go off and do any form of aholic behaviour. It's a fix that deals with the immediate emotions and the immediate stresses. That's why people become shopaholics. But also, that's why people become alcoholics. It's also why people become addicted to sex, why people become addicted to money and its acquisition or its spending. Because what they are doing is not necessarily wanting to do those activities directly. I've never heard of an alcoholic who actually wanted to become an alcoholic. What they're doing is they're trying to assuage the inner hurt from what has already happened elsewhere in their life. Now, if you want to help somebody with their shopaholic tendencies, what you don't do, you don't say, stop shopping, because it won't help. Because the problem isn't the shopping, the problem is there. If, on the other hand, you can get rid of the work problem, then you may find that you don't need to go shopping in the same way. You don't need to hit the bottle or whatever else of the aholic behaviour is that we're talking about.
Well, this is a good moment to take a break. In part 2, we'll learn how to cope with stress.